If you were an alien, you just happened to show up right now, you'd go, oh my God, look at where these guys are. They've been like popping along for billions of years and doing absolutely nothing. And all of a sudden, look, the population's exploding. They are just about to create like technologies that are as smart, more smart than human beings. What a great time for us to have discovered this planet, right?
Right.
Then imagine one of those aliens said, okay, let's check out, how do they run this stuff down there? And they look at the 200 plus divisions with different types of governments and systems, some of whom talk to each other, some of whom don't trust each other, some of whom are actively fighting wars. They'd be like, there's no way this is going to work.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Thompson, CEO of The Atlantic, and this is The Most Interesting Thing in AI, a podcast from my team on the business side of The Atlantic and thus independent of The Atlantic's editorial staff. Thank you to our supporting sponsor for this episode, PwC, a leader in helping organizations use AI. Earlier this year, I had a conversation with Yoshua Bengio, one of the godfathers of AI. When we spoke, Bengio said he wanted greater cooperation between China and the US when it comes to AI. Bengio is not the only person thinking about those risks. Another is Ian Bremmer. He leads the Eurasia Group, a political consultancy focused on foreign policy. Now, some of the things that Ian has spent his career thinking about, like America's technological advantage over its foes, its relationship with its allies, are changing and quickly. I want to speak with Ian about how AI is shifting the international balance of power and whether he sees cooperation as the solution. So with that, here's my conversation with Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer, it is a delight to have you here on The Most Interesting Thing in AI. So you are very well known for your theory that the institutions meant to regulate AI are not keeping pace with the speed of the evolution of AI. You've also said that you think they might start to keep pace once there is an AI catastrophe. Since it's fun to start a podcast with catastrophe, what might that catastrophe be? And we'll go from there.
I don't think we're far from it. I'm not like the Eliezer Yudkowsky AI doomer, we're all going to die view. I don't think I'm even the Elon Musk 20%, like, the robots take over, the paper clips get made, and there's nothing
Right,
left
your P-doom is low.
My P-doom is low.
But the odds of something bad happening, you think, are high.
Are close to 100, yeah. And I mean, because we're already seeing it, right? I mean, like, we just saw the open AI bot that in principle escaped its sandbox and like went and hacked into Hugging Face in order to, sort of get the...
And left notes behind for its successors. It's very weird.
It's very weird. But I mean, that Mythos fable, we're already in an environment where it would be very, in principle, easy to deploy advanced AI models to hack into critical infrastructure. And maybe the Chinese already have those capabilities. Maybe a bunch of Americans already have those capabilities that we wouldn't necessarily trust.
Have those capabilities or have already done it. Do you think the Chinese have already hacked into our infrastructure?
Sure, of course. But I mean, I'm talking about like hacking in a way that will break things, right, that will come. Because the great thing about the Chinese hacking is frequently they're hacking and lurking. They're not hacking and destroying.
Right. And
as long as there's a level of mutually assured economic destruction, that's probably reasonably safe. In fact, there's some areas where you want them hacking. And I've been, a little tangent, I've been told by the CIA that I should actually bring my personal devices into China when I go into China, and I do. The reason being, number one, they're almost certainly already in our systems. Number two, if you then go and don't bring your own, bring burners, they assume that you are trying to hide things from them that they aren't aware of, and they will therefore pay closer attention. And I have a number of colleagues that feel the same way.
So you bring your devices in because they're already hacked, and because if you didn't do it, they would get hacked.
Yeah, and frankly, there is nothing in my devices that I have. I mean, I don't take any money from the Chinese. I have no problem with the idea. Like, if they understood what I was writing about and the analysis I'm doing and knew the internal emails, they would probably trust the authenticity of my work more.
Also, if they hacked your phone, they'd know a lot more about Major League Baseball.
They would know more. I don't know if they would know a lot more. I mean, look, they're starting with a low bar, so maybe they know a lot more. That's probably true.
All right, in any case, so let's go back to the catastrophe that might happen.
Yeah, so we already at the point where at any moment you could have a mid-tier bank, a colonial pipeline style hack. I mean, those things clearly are significantly more vulnerable now to hacking than they were 5 years ago.
Sure, but if there's a hack of a mid-tier bank, that's not enough to inspire regulation or a change.
No, I'm not there yet. But there was already enough of a crisis to inspire taking Mythos off the market, which assumedly is costing a lot of money, missed opportunity revenue for a company that has an extravagant PE ratio and a need to commercialize with a great deal of urgency.
Right.
So that's already, you can call it, I don't know if you want to call it regulation when you say, no, we're literally putting export controls on you. And by the way, the only reason it's export controls is because we don't have a legal mechanism to force you to withdraw it, but we're telling you to withdraw it. That's pretty significant.
And you think, okay, let's stay on that for a second. I've asked you this question. We're going to come back to the question, but let's stay with this Anthropic Mythos question. Yeah. So the government basically whacks Anthropic on the head with these export controls. Do you think it was genuinely because they were concerned about Anthropic's model, or do you think it was because the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, kind of just don't like Anthropic?
No,
you don't think so?
Absolutely not. I feel very confident about that. Before Hegseth got into the fight with Dario, Anthropic was arguably doing more with U.S. Defense Department than any of the major AI models.
Right.
And that was intended to continue. And Hegseth is not exactly a luminary on U.S. AI policy, if I can understate that.
Not a lot of disagreement here.
Stipulated, right? Yes. So, no, I don't think that was the issue at all. I think that specifically the financial types and Besant, but also Powell, who was in place at that point, seeing that these models were indeed dangerous, that Anthropic's security in preventing the Chinese from getting in was inadequate, and that U.S. National Security Agency was vulnerable to when they were doing their own tests. They were finding, oh, this has the ability to find and deploy and exploit hacks, bugs for hacks. That's a serious problem. And so immediately we've got to make sure that we have a group of financial institutions that can find any vulnerabilities and can fix them. And that's what they did with Project Glasswing, and they brought him in.
I'm a little skeptical of it, right? You see David Sachs's sort of snide comments on Twitter all day about Anthropic. You see the way the government talks about Anthropic, and it does seem like there's a personal clash. And there's a sort of philosophical tension between the way the Trump administration works and the way Anthropic works, and that played a role in the suddenness of the decision and kind of the haphazardness of the decision. And had it been a partner that they didn't have animosity towards, there would have been a more deliberate process as they looked through and evaluated the evidence of the danger of the new Anthropic model.
I can accept that they might have communicated it differently. The outcome would have been the same. Mm-hmm. Once you are aware that you have a model that is capable of exploiting cyber vulnerabilities at that scale, you are going to ensure that it is taken down.
So the Anthropic thing, whatever the motivations are, spurred real government action. But what is the thing that spurs collaboration across the international system, that gets the United States and China to kind of change the direction they're going in, that maybe gets an international...
I'm not sure that's going to happen, first of all.
There's no scenario where that happens.
No, there are scenarios, but I'm not sure that is the direction that we're heading. So let's go back to the first question you asked, which is, what's the catastrophe that's coming? I don't think that the catastrophe that comes is a cyber catastrophe. I think because we're going to be, first of all, the organizations, the national security organizations and the systemically important financial institutions are some of the most capable in already dealing with cyber exploits and responding to them. They're very highly attuned to these vulnerabilities. And the fact that AI can find and exploit them faster doesn't change that basic resilience, right? So I could see a 10x colonial pipeline because they were running on old systems and they weren't that good. And you could imagine, that's why I mentioned a second-tier bank or whatever. That's not a catastrophe. Plus, there's going to be a market response to that, right? I mean, you're going to want to be able to patch and have more effective cybersecurity. AI will facilitate that, right? So there'll be products for that. There's a market for that. I'm much more worried about bioweapons. Most of the people that I talk to in the AI space believe that the ability to have AI frontier models that can help you develop new bioweapons at a systemically dangerous scale is 6 months.
But to make a bioweapon, you don't just need an AI that says, hey, here's how to make a bioweapon, which requires a little bit of skill. The AIs have some blocks to try to make it harder, but yeah, you can get around that. You then actually need a lab to make the bioweapon. Like it's still hard, right? And there's some like resources that are hard to get. You really think it's only 6 months away?
No, some of those things are potentially cloud labs that agents can actually exploit. You're using labor that isn't necessarily aware of each of the components of what you're doing, and you're stringing them together. That level of complexity is not far away. It's not more than a year away.
So who's building this bioweapon? Terrorists, Iran?
Tinkerers, governments, corporations, people that like are saying, "Oh, I wonder if I can do this." Right? Like, I mean, there's always some of that possibility. Right? If you have the ability for one person to do that or 3 people to do that, that's already too many.
Right. If everybody in the world could press a button and set off a nuclear bomb, probably
we wouldn't be here.
Somebody would have done it.
Exactly. So, and that's why, I mean, so the nuclear issue, it's far too complex. It's both in terms of the materials, and we know what the fissile materials are, and we can track them. With new bioweapons that are being created, it's not like you're tracking plutonium. You have to create systems that can track new types of things that right now we're not even looking for.
Right.
So it's not like you're following smallpox vaccine. You're following this other thing that may not set off any alarm bells. So you have to create new avenues for resilience.
Let's to be precise. So the scenario you're worried about is some tinkerer, some terrorist, some bad actor. They go into the AI model. They figure out how to make a new bioweapon. They make the new bioweapon. They release it.
They deploy it,
And then chaos. Ideally, it's contained, right? And then there's real government action and real government institutions that are set up to deal with these threats?
Well, the regulations that you get in response to a crisis is always overwhelmingly, let's respond to that crisis. So it's like, we will make sure that you will take your shoes off going forward because one person tried to have their shoes. So it is plausible that the response to this crisis is arbitrarily narrow and really expensive and inefficient, right? But when I see on OpenAI's foundation site that one of the things that they are putting real money into right now is advanced masks and building filtration systems and other hard devices that will allow you to live through a bioweapon that's used, that obviously they're worried about someone using their model or someone else's model to do that. This is real for them.
Right. And in fact, we had a group of the CEOs all come together and say, guys, we've got to really think about these bioweapons, which suggests that maybe they know something. And they presumably have the logs, and they can presumably see if people are trying to do this and experimenting with this. And they can presumably see how close people are getting to succeeding with it.
So one of the sets of regs that you're going to need will be the ability to track the tokens. And then, you're also going to want to have more effective regs on all of the organizations which have potential dual use for legal, biological, biotech development and potentially problematic biotech.
So this gets pretty complicated, Ian. So in order to stop this, you kind of need to surveil everybody's use of AI.
At least when it comes to those sorts of uses. I don't know how you get around if you have AI capabilities that are clearly potentially creating existential threats, then you need to prevent AI from doing those things. Now, so far, a lot of the conversation has been, well, we just need to make sure that the AI can't escape its existing rules. Nobody thinks that's plausible.
But let's stay with the privacy trade-off there. So in order to do that, you would need the AI companies to all save their logs. And you would, in fact, need the open source AI companies to somehow save their logs, even though it's not even clear who would have those logs if the model is taken and it's adopted and it's moved somewhere else. You're going to need a lot of surveillance, and maybe you're going to need to narrow the AI ecosystem in order to do this.
I could easily see a situation where open source is seen as more problematic by the U.S. government as a consequence.
Is it seen as more problematic by Ian Bremmer?
Not necessarily. No. Again, because I'm generally uncomfortable with a maximally intrusive government system that can surveil everything that its citizens can do. And we are moving very rapidly in that direction, irrespective of what you and I are talking about on AI.
Right.
We see that with video surveillance. We see that with call logs. We see that with the ability to monitor every keystroke that you're making, companies doing that, all of this sort of thing, right? We know that. We see that with just the way that young people use social media and put everything online, right? The transparency that kids have today with that the whole world has on their lives compared to you and me, we're like blank slates before the internet age. You have literally no idea other than some snapshots what you and I did.
Yeah.
And that's probably for the best, right? Yeah, I think it is for you anyway. So anyway, leaving that aside, I worry about that direction. But the fact that I don't necessarily want a government that might exploit it to have that access doesn't mean I don't want that access to be had.
So then square these things. So A, you are very concerned about this, legitimate. B, you believe that one of the ways to limit the risks of this is to know what everybody is typing so that A, you can stop it, and so that you can also like work backwards and maybe see what the bioweapon is. It would be very useful to have these logs. And C,
or know which tokens are being used.
And you're very concerned about mass surveillance. How do you get all three of these things?
Exactly. So it is a trilemma, is it not? You can have two very easily, but three is hard. One way at that would be that the organization that does the surveilling is limited in its authority to what is actually focusing on. It is not the U.S. government. It is instead a more technocratic, licensing type institution. I mean, you saw Demis Hassabis talking about like we need a FINRA type institution, right? Like so one can imagine that the future of AI is we need AI to work, but we also understand that there are systemic vulnerabilities that come from bad misuse of AI. And in that regard, the right analogy is not the nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. The right analogy is the financial marketplace.
Right.
We have central bank governors. We do, the Chinese do, the Europeans do. They are independent, not just nominally independent, but quite independent from their governments. And the reason for that is so they have the ability to act to ensure that we do not have systemic economic challenges. So when there are challenges, when there are problems with the financial marketplace, someone is trying to use this information, create a run, destroy a marketplace, you want to ensure that, number one, you can identify that risk, you can communicate it to all relevant actors as soon as humanly possible, and you can contain it.
We're going to need to create a FINRA-like system financed by governments, financed by corporations.
I've thought of it as like a financial stability board, but for AI. So an AI stability board. Financed, you could finance it with a tax on tokens, for example. So it could be private sector subsidized, but literally just as a, think of it as a licensing fee that people that are engaged in AI usage, most of which will be coming from industry and from defense, not from consumers who don't need the most advanced and don't need it to be working.
Tax on tokens levied on the companies or levied on the user?
It could be levied on the company or on the user. I don't think it necessarily matters who pays it. It's on the token, right? So, but either way, it's going to be paid. If it's on the company, that's going to raise their price. If it's on the user, then fine.
Reduce their use or whatever.
Right now, for the last years, you've had a staggering amount of money spent on building out the most impressive frontier AI models to get to AGI, if that's possible, as fast as we even can. There's been a tiny, tiny fraction of that amount of money spent on ensuring alignment, spent on ensuring safety, spent on ensuring security. I am arguing that imbalance is unsustainable.
Totally.
So someone is going to need to spend some actual money to ensure that there's safety and alignment.
But you could put the steering wheel in a couple places. You could make it all the steering wheels inside the companies, right? You could mandate that they spend a certain amount on safety. You could mandate that they do X, Y, Z. You could put the steering wheel in like an organization that's between the companies and the government, like your FINRA proposal. Yeah. And you could put the steering wheel like in the government itself.
And in China, it will be in the government.
Right.
That seems clear.
But explain why you think the steering wheel should be in this middle organization as opposed to inside the companies or inside the U.S. government.
Well, inside the companies, you're going to have a coordination problem that not all companies will necessarily approach it in the same way. And that will create vulnerabilities for those that are playing fast and loose. If you have systemic challenges...
I mean, we already kind of have that.
We do.
You have a competitive advantage to not... I mean, this is why even Anthropic spends less on safety than they intended
then
to.
they clearly would intend to. Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I would argue that you don't want to have a, sort of a race to the bottom approach that comes from shorter term market dynamics when it comes to the safety of your national security, of individual users of society, those sorts of things. Those are things that you just need to create costs for because they're public goods.
Yep.
They're public goods. I do think that the government is an effective response to that. And I think that in China, that will likely be the response. It already is the response, and it will continue to be. But I worry that in an open society, in a society where we value individual rights, that allowing a central government to have that kind of surveillance capability, even if that is not the intent, can be misused.
Right. All right. So you need the surveillance capability. You need to incentivize the model companies to spend more on safety. You can do this more through this kind of middle organization modeled on FINRA or something else. How do you prevent this organization from getting captured by the model companies? Either A, getting captured by the model companies, or B, being used essentially as a tool to lock down the market so there end up only being 5 competitors as opposed to 20.
Yeah, well, I mean, the latter is a problem no matter what, because if it's a winner-take-all model and it's incredibly expensive to develop these models and also to develop the devices on which people engage with the models, then the advantages those companies will have to identify nascent competitors and either buy them or kill them is very, very high.
Right.
And I would say that is a greater concern about lack of competition than what comes from the licensing organization.
Though it is also true that the stricter the regulations you put on the AI industry, the more you advantage the big companies that can afford to hire the lawyers to pay for to deal with the regulations.
Sure. Yes. Absolutely.
So you need to set up FINRA in such a way that it doesn't lock in a competitive world where there are reasons why we might end up with 5, 6, 7 companies as opposed to 20.
But you'd rather not be because of the licensing requirements.
I'd rather have the licensing requirement not contribute to those problems already. In fact, I would like the government to work in the opposite direction using antitrust and whatever other methods it has to try to make sure there is as competitive and wide a market of responsible players as there can be. That would be my policy
That'd be awesome. It's unlikely to work that way, right?
I feel that seems like the response to a lot of my government proposals.
Yeah, no, I know. It's a problem because, so much of when we're talking about the most strategic industries that require the most money, we're also talking about those people that have the most capacity to spend an ungodly amount of money to make sure the things that really matter to them are defended in the reg structure, whatever it is.
All right, so back to FINRA. So we want to set it up in a way that doesn't lock in a small number of companies. We want to set it up in a way that isn't captured by the other companies. We also want to make sure it's extremely well funded so they have the expertise to properly evaluate the models. And then we need to, the reason FINRA works is that all the banks have the same incentive, right? If any bank goes down, all the banks are in trouble. Right. And I suppose that's similar in AI.
That's clearly similar in AI.
Right, because any model goes rogue, it's bad for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, because everyone is going to suddenly say, wait a second, we find unacceptable that level of capacity with AI. And there's going to be backlash against all
right, so this FINRA organization works for just US AI companies, or does it involve the whole West? Is Europe part of it? Is Canada part of it? And then is China ultimately part of it?
Well, clearly, this is one of the biggest problems we have with AI, is that if the Americans do not have a significant and lasting lead over the Chinese, and it's very unlikely that we will,
right?
Then keeping the Chinese out of such an environment is ultimately self-defeating.
Right.
Because, whatever you have, they're going to have. Now, and relying on their government.
Well, in fact, trying to set it up and saying you're keeping China out will make it harder to get it set up because all the U.S. companies that are in it will say, well, now we're going to lose to China.
They can say that, but you can still set up that reg process.
Right.
I mean, that I don't think necessarily means it fails. Again, especially if this is happening in response to a crisis, there will be an overwhelming desire to say, okay, we got to respond to that crisis.
Right, fair enough. If there's a crisis, they're going to be motivated enough to do it, and they may use this argument, but it won't be effective.
So you do want ultimately AI government. Look, if you were an alien, and you look down at the planet right now. You just happen to show up right now. You'd go, oh my God, look at where these guys are. They've been popping along for billions of years and doing absolutely nothing. And all of a sudden, look, the population's exploding, the technology's exploding. They are just about to create technologies that are as smart, more smart than human beings. What a great time for us to have discovered this planet, right?
Right.
Then imagine one of those aliens said, okay, let's check out how do they run this stuff down there. what kind of governance do they have? And they look at the 200 plus divisions, territorial divisions, with different types of governments and systems, some of whom talk to each other, some of whom don't trust each other, some of whom are actively fighting wars. And they'd be like, there's no way this is going to work, right? You cannot have this level of transformative global technology and not have global governance at some level. And I'm not someone who believes in world government. I don't think we need the United Nations taking over from governments. I think national governments are fine. But I think there are some areas of governance where you have to have global, not just coordination, but oversight. The financial marketplace happens to be one of them.
Yep.
And AI, nuclear weapons, turns out doesn't need to be. Climate doesn't necessarily need to be, because it can be done by smaller number of actors in different ways. I mean, through deterrence on nuclear, though that's starting to fall apart, and through market incentives to invest in technological changes on climate. Again, those are inadequate,
right,
but they're moving us at least in the right direction, right? Where when it comes to, you couldn't do financial place regulation unless it's global.
Right.
And you, in my view, you can't do AI regulation unless it's global. So this is an area that we're going to require giving away some level of sovereignty.
Okay, so there has to be global regulation of some sort, but not through the United Nations, which would be the natural organization to do it through?
Look, I helped create this high-level panel on AI.
I know you were one of the original.
And we
were you one of the original chairs, or were you just one of the original?
I was the rapporteur,
okay.
But I got the Secretary General to start it, right?
Yeah.
And we've been talking about it for almost 10 years now. So I'm really quite proud of the fact that this is like something they moved, and it was really good. It was the recommendations were accepted by almost every country in the world except Russia. So the U.S., the Chinese, the Europeans are all on board. And we even created an institution, an international panel on AI that kind of works a little like the IPCC on climate change. But it doesn't have power. The purpose was, let's ensure that we have experts that
kind of like the IPCC.
Right. But the IPCC proved very useful because it was able to create a large group of global scientists.
Right, created great data, but little enforcement. No enforcement capability.
You could not get to the point that you would convince governments all over the world that climate change was happening and needed to be responded to, whatever the response is, unless you had first the scientific full consensus that this is what is happening, these are the impacts.
True. Agree with my question here is, so that would be an argument for creating a IPC-like organization through the UN, and maybe that is sufficient.
For AI, it's not sufficient, but it is a necessary but insufficient institution.
So the UN plays this necessary but insufficient role, where it's like the IPCC, and where it sort of creates information, creates opportunities for people to communicate with each other, and it does a bunch of good stuff.
Identifies the nature of the opportunities and challenges.
But you're still going to need a way for the U.S. and China to set some kind of rules and to
you're going to need enforcement,
right?
And you're going to need resources, and those things do not happen through the UN.
Right.
Those things will have to happen through agreement of the U.S., of China, of the big heads of the corporations.
So there's going to have to be some kind of world agreement, and what will spur this is some kind of national crisis, some kind of international crisis that takes everybody, and they're shocked.
Yeah. Now, I think there is a question about whether or not there will be an effort by the United States and China to simply do that in a bilateral basis.
Which may be sufficient, since so much of the top AI is dominated by those two countries.
It may be, and yet if you believe that actually open source means that so much of this is diffuse and so quickly, and that means that even if they make most of the profits through U.S. and Chinese companies, that the capabilities are being developed at a human level and at an agentic level, well, then suddenly having an agreement between the U.S. and China doesn't get you where you need to be. Where the Americans and Soviets were more than sufficient to create a baseline of stability and security on the nukes.
Like, the U.S. and China make a bilateral agreement, but because the Chinese models and Meta's Llama model are open source, those models will be adapted by the Zimbabweans, and those will be just as powerful. And wait, now we need Zimbabwe as part of this treaty.
Or now you need at least the agency has to have some level of real authority over things that are not happening within the sovereignty of U.S. and Chinese space. Where when it came to a U.S.-Soviet nuclear agreement, arms control agreement, you didn't need to worry very much about any other country.
Right. All right. Let's talk about another big topic, which is technology and democracy. You and I, by the way, wrote a story together 8 years ago, the AI Cold War, partly pointing out that the arc of technology was kind of bending towards tyranny. Do you think it is still bending towards tyranny?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you?
I actually think that AI has an opportunity to go in the other direction.
I agree, but as of where it's heading now.
As of where it's heading right now, probably. But I think I'm less concerned than most people are, in part because I think that one effect, and I'm curious your view on this, social media pushes people to extremes, right? It leads to a world where you elect Donald Trump and where the politics in this country kind of break, right? It puts people into filter bubbles. AI maybe does the opposite, right? And it may drive people more towards consensus. It may allow us to challenge our thoughts. And if you look at the political effect that AI seems to be having, it's the opposite of social media. Like you get and you spend time on social media and you go like this. You get on AI and you spend time and you go a little bit like this, right? Now, of course, with AI, you can create alternative realities and you can like make the extremes in the filter bubbles even worse. And you can look at the way the social media algorithms work with AI and you can look at what's happening on Twitter. You can make the opposite conclusion. But I wonder whether there's a way it makes democracy work better.
The thing that makes me worry most about AI is very different than social media. It's not the disinformation. It's not the anonymity. It's not the polarization, extremism. It's more that human beings are getting programmed faster by AI than most human beings are programming AI. So, I mean, you're being algorithmically nudged into directions that are valuable for the companies. And that doesn't mean the companies are nefarious. It just means that that happens to be an indirect effect of the business model. So, the glazing effect that goes on with AI, where you have like AIs that really want to make sure that you spend more time with the AI. So it's, making sure that like it really shows that you're so smart and it's engaging and what else would you want to know and all of this stuff. But it doesn't have any affect towards you whatsoever. Now, in the real world, we do encounter people like that. We call them sociopaths. And we keep our kids away from them because they're dangerous. But in AI land, we actually engage more with them. And I do worry that if we head into an environment where for lots of us, the most important relationship that we have, that we communicate with, that knows us the best, knows us more than our spouses, than our doctors, than our accountants, than our coworkers, all of that, turns out to be an AI bot. I think that's very destructive of our social connections. I think it's very destructive of our political models. So I'm worried about it in a different way.
Definitely destructive of our social life, right? And I don't like that world. And it drives me. Anybody who looks forward to the world of AI girlfriends and who's not worried about the amount of control and power that AI models have over us and the amount of information that we give the algorithms, they're wrong. But necessarily, why is this likely to be so harmful to democracy? Like it is a bad thing, but why does that mean it's a bad thing for democracy?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. And democracy does require people, I think, to have affect for their fellow human beings.
Right.
To have connection with a community around them that they value, that they engage with, that they touch, that they feel. Algorithmic-driven connections don't do that.
Right.
So I'm not saying that necessarily drives us towards authoritarianism, though if it turns out that it's a winner-take-all model with a small number of individuals that have control of a hell of a lot of surveillance data, they will nudge us to do whatever it is that the hell they want us to do. So that there's a risk that becomes a system that gets manipulated by a relatively small number of people. But leaving that aside...
Though there's also the potential counterpoint that it allows everybody to become so much more intelligent and so much more powerful. There's actually an equalizing effect because people have access to the same models. So there's a risk you could take that one in either direction.
I would love to be in a system where everyone has access to the same models. I don't believe that for a second.
Well, but as you said, if through diffusion the models all become quite similar and they become like we all have the same water, right?
Oh, yeah.
And if we end up having similar models, because the difference between the best expensive models and the cheap free models is very small, maybe we will end up with not identical models, right? And there will be the advantage of having a 1% more better model when models are extremely intelligent will be quite high. it is possible that there could be a leveling effect of AI.
I'd love to see that. It seems to me that things like people not having electricity, like half of Africa, implies that half of Africa is probably not going to have access to great AI. It seems to me, and again, no question that AI, if it creates extraordinary abundance and productivity, costs of everything come down, energy comes down, but infrastructure has to be built.
Definitely, right? And like Africa will lag way behind because of electricity, but it is also true that much more of Africa has electricity than 10 years ago, and that technology has brought a lot to many parts of the world, particularly India and China.
I guess I expect that at least in the near term, and near term is, let's say, 3 to 5 years in a world that's moving so fast, that there will be significant trade-offs in terms of what you are using your compute for, where that energy is and isn't going, right? I mean, if so much energy needs to go for AI, for industrial uses that are incredible, and for defense uses that are incredible, then what about the people that aren't able to actually pay for and don't have the labor that's necessarily as valuable for those uses?
So ultimately, your fear is that AI is going to drive massive income inequality. And if it drives massive income inequality, I agree that if indeed it drives massive income inequality, that is bad for democracy. And I also do agree that if we start falling in love with our AI chatbots and it becomes our most important relationships, we will lose some of the, fellowship that makes democracy work.
My fundamental fear, though, is actually it's easier to express than that. I mean, those things are all true. I think that this is moving too fast for our institutions and our leaders to be thoughtful about ensuring that people are taken care of.
That is true.
And when that happens, we tend to break things. Mm-hmm. Our society doesn't put a value. We value GDP, right? And
okay, so let's do it this way. Let's say that I said, Ian, you now run OpenAI and Anthropic
together.
Congratulations, they've merged, and you're the CEO of it. You need to reorient these companies so that their products are maximally beneficial to democracy, right? What would you do? And I'm going to actually have a little aside. So maybe 4 years ago, Ian and I had this conversation, like, what is the thing that we could conceivably do for democracy? And we came up with this idea, like, what if you could create a social media platform that pushed people towards consensus as opposed to...
It was a fun...
It was fun.
Idea.
Right? And as one venture capitalist said, you're trying to sell kale in a candy shop. And the idea, we sold the idea. Let's put it that way.
Yes, let's put it that way.
We did not supplant Twitter, which was the initial plan. So what are the things that could be done by people like you or me or folks listening to this podcast, or Ian when he's running Anthropic and OpenAI, to actually make AI and tech be good for democracy?
Well, one thing you need to do is you need to actually test rolling out AI with smaller numbers of very different kinds of people to see how they engage with each other as a consequence of using that in a serious way, which takes time. Like, we can't just roll out AI and say, well, it's going to be great, and who cares what the consequences are? Like, you and I know, like, even during a pandemic, you've got vaccines. This can save a lot of lives, but you need to test the vaccines first. If you don't test them, you're not going to roll them out. We've got GMOs. You test them. You don't just roll them out, right? We're actually rolling out these incredibly powerful human being programming devices, and we don't know what their effect they're going to have on society.
I mean, to some degree, we do. Like, Mythos was rolled out starting in January to like select groups, and then to a small number of corporations.
With different implications, right? I mean, you want to see, like, is it going? In this case, it was let's see, like, if it actually lives within its confines. You asked me a completely different thing. You asked me about how do you use something. How do you ensure that we actually either maintain or strengthen democracy, which has nothing to do with the business model of either Anthropic or OpenAI.
Right.
So you would suddenly need to reorient the business model
towards
our top priority would be first testing these things to maximize for that, for constructive human interactions, not towards ensuring that you maximize the use of the AI bot. but how might you ensure, like, in other words, how would you, instead of saying, oh, that's a really interesting question, what else can I help you with? It would be, oh, who in your network do you most trust on these issues? Have you asked that person about that? You've never had an interaction with an AI bot that has said, oh, you should get off this AI bot and actually talk to Timmy.
Right.
That's never happened, right?
No.
Well, that's just the tipping point. Right. So in other words, right now you have business models that are incredibly powerful, run by very masterful salespeople to solve for challenges that have literally nothing to do with what you just asked.
Right. So you would have to kind of from the ground up reorient these big companies towards fixing democracy. Now,
you have to sell kale in a candy shop. You would have to
all right, let me run another theory by you.
Fine.
So one of my favorite theories in AI is from Audrey Tang, right? The former digital minister in Taiwan. And one of Audrey's theories is that there's this vertical race, right? Which is what we've just been talking about. And it's these masterful salespeople in these incredible companies, and they're heading towards trillion-dollar valuations, and they're competing with each other in all kinds of ways, right? And that's the vertical race. And then there's a horizontal race where there's a whole bunch of institutions, and it's nonprofits and it's academics and it's good-hearted individuals, and they're kind of building values into AI, and they're building like better evals, and they're building authentication methods, and they're building ways of testing to see whether tokens have been used for bioweapons while maintaining anonymity. And the question is whether the horizontal race can move as fast as the vertical race. And so actually, if that model is correct, and if Audrey's hypothesis is correct, then maybe the way that AI ends up being positive for democracy as opposed to negative is through something happening in this horizontal way, right? Through some nonprofit, through people at a startup who are like, maybe we can do something about building AI that gets people offline and talking to individuals in places where they should.
Look, I mean, Wikipedia in the early days of the net, right, had feelings of that.
Right.
Right? It's like everyone's doing social media, but then you have this one thing that all these people are participating in.
The craziest thing about the internet, like, it's the one place where you have the most truth, right? It is the most trustworthy place on the internet versus all of these other places that, at the beginning.
And to be fair, it is not anymore, right? It has gotten more politicized.
It's gotten more politicized, and it's going to get overrun by AI
Exactly.
and all kinds of problems.
But there was a point in which the Audrey idea actually worked for a really important piece of the internet. The more time you spent on Wikipedia, actually, the less polarized you became.
And you learned more about COVID, right?
Learned more about everything.
Right, and you go into every other social media site and you get totally lost, and you end up learning less and end up being dumber.
So could there be something like that for AI,
and
where
what
like
is
a
that
whole
thing?
bunch of people are participating in the things that actually help to create the prompts for your model? Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yes.
Like instead of you and I trying to figure out just how to get through our inbox and create a personal CRM, which is what everyone is using it for.
Right.
Instead, actually, no, we have a whole bunch of really thoughtful, smart people from different walks of life all over the world that care about humanity and quality of life and all of these things and personal well-being and the rest. And they are creating prompts, really, really well thought through experimental prompts that then when you and I or our kids first have an experience with Claude or with Perplexity or whatever, you take that and you input it. And it does all the things it says we want you to steel man and not straw man, and don't just build me up, and also engage with other human beings, and all of these things. And here are resources you should use, and I will try to find them for you on a regular basis. That as a starter manual, as an additive pack that is given to you by whoever. And by the way, I think that feels to me like something that would be aligned with Leo's encyclical, which we need more of.
Right. It was one of the most important and best documents on AI. So this is interesting. So now I think we are agreeing that this may be whatever this thing is, whether it's a prompt master, whether it's something else, but trying to build the values of the encyclical into this horizontal race, or what ultimately redeems the vertical race. So now, back to my question, is it inevitable that kind of the vertical race wins out and democracy ends up suffering?
But my problem is that the vertical race is going too fast. That's the problem. I don't think we have time. Given time, we can get this right.
Right.
It's true of most things. It's like I'm not someone who wants us to stop progress at all. I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it's worth spending resources on. But I think when it comes to certain types of developments that are dangerous to society, it is worth spending more resources and taking more time.
Yeah.
And right now, unfortunately, we are in this, not only are we in this race, we're in a race internally in the United States, given the nature of individualism and winner take all and who are you? It's what I make, it's who I am, it's how much money I have. We're in a race with the Chinese, two big countries that really hate each other, really don't trust each other, antithetical systems, as opposed to if we were racing with the Canadians or the Brits or whatever, it'd be easier. We're in a global environment that really lacks leadership and that has institutions that aren't aligned with our baseline balance of power. And that's the moment when this incredible technologies come in. It's unfortunate.
It is rather
We
unfortunate.
need more time. The political scientist in me says this is not the moment to be really optimistic about whether we're going to get this right.
Let's talk about China, though. You and I wrote this piece 8 years ago. A lot of it was prescient. We saw some things that were coming. We got a bunch of things right. One thing we definitely did not anticipate was that China would be the leader in open source AI.
Yeah, that's right.
How does AI develop in China in the next 3 years, and what are the differences in the way the Xi Jinping government thinks about AI from the way the American government thinks about AI?
Well, the principal difference has been they think that AI is overwhelmingly going to be the game changer for industrial and defense use.
Right.
It's not about AGI. It's not about getting to AGI first. It's not about transforming humanity, which they mistrust. It's much more about let's make sure that we have all the compute, all the talent, all the energy, cheap, and that we can deploy that to build world-class robotics, world-class biotech, world-class material science, win the electrification at scale, cheap, and export that all over the world.
Right.
And Xi Jinping's speech in Shanghai a couple weeks ago, it will be over a month ago by the time this comes out, was quite the show of confidence that that strategy is paying off for them big time.
Right.
Yeah.
So you think that they win is the wrong phrase, but as we tie ourselves up in knots, as we make the wrong choices on energy policy, China's making a lot of good choices, right? They're moving towards solar energy in a way that's going to be extremely helpful when we move into an AI era. They're pushing open models that seem to be advancing without the same costs as the US models. They're building it into robotics. They have the rare earth minerals stack. They're in a very strong position.
They're in a very strong position on the things that you just mentioned.
And there's no popular backlash to AI.
They have actual growth of maybe 1 or 2% as opposed to the 4 to 5 that they're talking about. They have corporations with extraordinary levels of bad debt. They have a real estate sector that's fallen apart. They have very high levels of youth unemployment that has caused a massive malaise among what should be the most productive parts of society. And the only part of their economy that's really working well is exporting huge amounts for cheap that is causing backlash around the world. And even as Trump has destroyed a lot of goodwill with allies, the Chinese are still considerably more mistrusted by government leaders, even if not by populations around the world. So China has done very well in a number of long-term strategic bets that will help them, but they are also utterly hobbled by some massive structural challenges. And we have to keep both of those things.
So how do those massive structural challenges, the real estate problem, the slow growth problem, the demographic problem, how do they change the way Chinese AI develops?
Well, one is it could just slow them down. Right. I mean, like, for example, they're no longer putting money into Belt and Road around the world. So they'd be much more effective at getting their tech into lots of other countries around the world if they were still investing lots of money.
Right. So if their real estate sector and the rest of the economy were doing better, they could do more to help Huawei sell their new, tiny chips and compete with NVIDIA across the world.
And be trusted in all these countries that now see China as the lead creditor that's acting in a predatory way, that's acting in an extractive way, and saying, well, we need to really be like hedging away from Chinese.
Do you think trust in China is going down faster than trust in the U.S.?
In different ways. Used to be China was considered the lead of the global South. It is not anymore. It's now the lead creditor to the global South, and it is trying to grab equity shares with a whole bunch of countries that see the Chinese as predatory. So it depends on who you're talking to.
Right.
I mean, the Americans are losing an awful lot of ground with Canada and with the Europeans, and the Chinese are losing an awful lot of ground with countries all over the global South, with India as well and others.
Is there any chance that Europe becomes a relevant player in AI? Not just as a regulator, but as a place where AI is created, where AI companies are built, or is that game over?
I think that Europe's opportunity is different. And I hope this doesn't sound too soft, but at a time when Americans mistrust AI in surveys more than any other country. And we're in principle the country that's supposed to be like most excited about leaning into new technology. So that says something bad about what Americans are thinking about the country right now, how much trust we do not have for our institutions and our leaders. If you go into a bar in the United States, you ask the person, what do you do? And that determines who you are. You also want to know kind of how much they make, right? How powerful they are. In Europe, that's not the way people answer questions, right? And I do think that if we are heading into a world where AI means that we don't need to do a lot of the things that we need to do, and there's going to be a lot of abundance, but we're going to have an existential challenge as a society in the United States because we've been valuing the things that the corporations have told us to value. The Europeans have not. And I think that to the extent that society in 10 years is still run by people as opposed to by algorithms, as opposed to by the people that control the algorithms, but if it's actually the citizens that still control society, we may have a lot more to learn from the Europeans in that environment.
So American self-worth is going to decline more because the things we value are more at risk from AI, even though AI is going to help the American economy more than the European economy.
I mean, I think it's already happening with Instagram. We are more susceptible as a society to Instagram because we see the influencers and we're like, oh, that's who we should be. And I don't think the Europeans have that same vulnerability because of society and what societies happen to value more. And it's different in different places. But I mean, if you're in Greece, you're in Italy, life is just, you're taking a lot more time for lunch. You're spending more time with your friends. You're taking more time for maternity and paternity leave and all of these things.
Right. And so your job is taken away by AI and it matters less
It
than here.
doesn't matter as much, but also your identity and self-worth and value, even if America has all of the money.
Right. You've completely inverted the traditional argument about how AI will affect US and Europe. I like this. Keep going.
Well, I mean, so many Americans that are worried about AI talk about UBI as the solution. Right? Universal basic income. When that seems to me is like the most American like way of thinking about it. Oh, you're not going to be making as much money. Let's make sure you get money. The challenge is not money. The challenge is, are you a happy person?
Right.
Money is something that corporations have decided this is how we should determine our self-worth because it works best for a corporate-led system. But that isn't about human beings.
Where do you think the American AI backlash comes from?
I mean, populism has been stronger for a while.
But populism is quite strong in many other places.
Yeah, but in the U.S., I mean, I do think that we have more power in the extremes, in the left and the right, than we see in Europe and Japan and South Korea. There are a lot of reasons that have driven it. I guess I think that in the same way that you had on the right a bunch of men who were not college educated, who felt displaced by later rounds of immigrants, who felt displaced by feminism and by women that were doing better and getting into college and all, and suddenly their relationships were different than Scott Galloway stuff and all of that. That got you Trump, right? And a whole bunch of other people like that. I do think that there is a progressive women, advanced degree, white collar, urban and suburban group that will react very negatively to tech companies that they think are run by men that only care about themselves, wildly narcissistic, very corrupt, deeply in bed with, sort of the government. That suddenly the white collar opportunities will be fewer and that there won't be opportunities for their kids. I think that is going to be the core demographic driver of the anti-AI backlash in the United States.
Right, because white-collar women, blue-collar women in service jobs are actually relatively protected from AI. But, when you think about women at a corporate law firm or, women
accountancy,
in accounting, right?
Yeah.
Those jobs are quite at risk. The companies are all led by men. So you think there's going to be a kind of a mirror image of the last populist backlash?
Yeah, and I think that it is not necessarily going to be the same kind. I don't think it'll be as much about identity politics, which failed with a lot of people.
So it's going to be a populist backlash centered in the areas where these women live and have political power, which is kind of blue urban areas?
Blue urban areas, blue suburban areas. It could be a lot of purple. I mean, you could see a lot of Michigan and Pennsylvania's in this. You could see Georgia's in this.
All right,
that
so
kind of
this
stuff.
female populist
Arizona.
backlash, what happens?
I think it's economic. But you asked me, where do I think the anti-AI backlash comes from, and that's what I think. It's like, okay, what are your policies going to be to protect us and our kids?
Yeah.
What are you going to do to invest in this class of Americans who are educated and, by the way, have some political power?
Right. So then,
And vote.
If you're running for office in 2028,
Right.
your position has got to be you're anti-AI in every way. You're obviously anti-data centers because everybody hates data centers.
You're anti-corruption. You're anti-kleptocracy. It starts with that because of Trump, and because that is the place where Trump has most misled his own base.
And you should, even if you're a Republican, you run on that, even though you have to be a little careful of it because you don't want them to whack you.
Got to be very careful to run on that, depending on which Republican you are. But certainly, I mean, like JD has a hard time running on that.
Right.
But he's got Tucker supporting him now, which helps him a little bit, right? So he doesn't have to be Kamala Harris for Trump, which is interesting. But on the left. Yeah, I think that you are not necessarily running against all AI, but you are definitely running in favor of policy solutions that show a level of redistribution. And so it's an actively economic populism. It's not an identity populism.
Right.
It's very different in that regard.
So it's an economic populism. It's somewhat anti-AI. It's certainly in favor of putting more pressure on the big AI companies, maybe getting equity stakes for the U.S. government, maybe a tax on tokens, maybe antitrust.
All that stuff.
All of those different levers.
And it may be completely subverted by, if we have a crisis before then, what the crisis is and how you react to the crisis.
Right.
Because that is always the principal driver when it happens.
Right. So it'll be like the Obama election in 2008, which happens in the middle of the financial crisis.
Exactly.
All right. Couple more questions. 15 years ago, I remember, maybe it was 20 years ago, you told me I should go work at Facebook, and you told me that I should go work at the place where like the most interesting decisions were being made that would most influence the world. If you were to have somebody like me, late 20s, figuring out where to go, where would you tell them to go now?
Yeah, probably Anthropic or OpenAI or one of those companies, you know, or something just below it, something startup-y, more startup-y kind of place, because those companies are already starting to get big and hard.
They're getting
to move
big
around.
and they're kind of congealed.
I'd rather have you find one that is like a 200-person firm,
right,
which has enough money that it's not going to die, but where you get to like learn everything from the people that are in different silos across the organization. That's where
that's the place to go. How is AI changing Eurasia Group? Right, so you run political risk consultancy, and
I don't. I own it. I don't run it. We have a CEO. Thank God.
But you're in a business that is at high risk of AI, as am I, right? Because companies that want to analyze what are the effects of the Venezuelan coup now have an alternative. They have a competitor to Eurasia Group because they can ask Claude or OpenAI. How do you deal with that?
So junior analysts who are doing open source research, even using AI, are much less valuable in that environment. What you need are people that are capable of taking information, that are networking actively with it to gain proprietary information, to know the bureaucrats that are in countries, to know the principal intellectuals that cover a certain space, the experts, are able to bring that and communicate it effectively through different mechanisms, including face-to-face, with a wide set of clients. And building out that network is an enormous differentiator. I also think, keep in mind—
so then how does someone get started?
You have to identify people that you think you can train into developing that.
Right.
So you want people that have more macro capabilities.
So you're hiring for different skills.
You're hiring for different skills. You're not hiring for expertise in an area, because that expertise is much more easily replicated. You're hiring for the ability to critically think, to push back, to be flexible intellectually, all of those things. Also keep in mind, my firm is only 260 people.
Right.
We are a global organization with clients all over the world. If I had 1,000 people, I would know today how to deploy them, but I can't because I don't have the money for 1,000 people. So for me, AI should allow all of my top analysts to become more effective at covering more space than they presently do. So what's critical for us is that we have analysts and we have graphics types and editors and all of these different areas of our firm that are constantly upgrading their ability to use AI so that they can be more effective. Because everyone in the firm should now have a really good executive assistant through AI, which is virtually costless. Right. And if they're not doing that, then that person's losing an arm. right?
Another work question. Are you going to write another book? Or do you think that books are going to become less valued and less relevant?
I have had this discussion with my people just last week. I am working on another book, and it is very much in process, but it's a big book. And it is a book that I think will stand up for longer. And it is about a topic that is much more evergreen. I think the utility of writing a book like I wrote, Us versus Them, which was reaction to the populist wave that we saw. It was kind of like a political version of Capital in the US, in Europe, and other countries. I think the utility of doing that over the course of a year and a half today has diminished dramatically.
Right.
Yeah.
Last question. If you had unlimited resources and you could spend it on anything you want in AI, what would you do?
I'd probably buy small equity stakes of a bunch of AI companies that are not in my field, but that are building information networks that are close to my field.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like identifying things like how agriculture patterns are changing and who's going to be more and less productive as a consequence of that, or real estate prices. If you get a whole bunch of interesting AI that can give you that kind of analytic advantage and plug that into a better understanding of geopolitics, and you don't need to own the firm.
Right.
You just need to have like the access to know what the hell they're doing and have them come in and force them to spend the time to spend with your analysts. See, the biggest problem I have is the people that are really, really good at AI, that are cutting edge in analytics, don't have the time to do anything but what they're doing. And what I really need them doing is spending some of their time training my best analysts.
Yeah.
So if I had small equity stakes of those firms, I could force them to do that. Yeah, I think that's what
That's a
I'd probably
good
do.
creative answer. All right, Ian Bremmer, thank you for being on The Most Interesting Thing in AI.
Pleasure, Nick.
This has been The Most Interesting Thing in AI. I'm Nicholas Thompson, and that was Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you for watching.